Well, good evening, Erev Tov to everyone. On behalf of the Lifelong Learning Committee, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. My name is Shoshana Silberman, and I'll be your host for this evening. So before I introduce our guest scholar, I'd like to go over some of the ground rules for tonight's program. Rabbi Spitzer will be responding to your questions following her presentation. So please use the chat function to pose your questions and send them to me, Shoshana, and I'll be curating them. To avoid unintended distractions, the audience will be muted throughout tonight's program. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Suzanne Esterman, who is serving as our Zoom master this evening. And I'm so pleased and honored to introduce our guest speaker. Rabbi Toba Spitzer has served Congregation Dorchei Tzedek since she was ordained in 1997 at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. She recently published God is Here, Reimagining the Divine, a book of popular theology that is already transforming hearts, minds, and lives. Rabbi Spitzer is a popular teacher of courses on Judaism and economic justice, Reconstructionist Judaism, new approaches to thinking about God, and the practice of integrating Jewish and spiritual teachings into daily life. She served as the president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association from 2007 to 2009, and was the first GBTQ rabbi to head a national rabbinic organization. Rabbi Spitzer has received the honor of being included in Newsweek's Top 50 Rabbis in America 2008 list and the 2008 Forward 50 list, as well as the 2010 Forward list of 50 female rabbis who are making a difference. She's the immediate past president of the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis. When I asked my son-in-law, Rabbi Daniel Brenner, who he would invite to speak at the Jewish Center, he immediately said, Toba Spitzer, and accolades followed. That week, coincidentally, I spoke to my daughter, Lisa, who told me that she had just read Toba's new book and found it very, very meaningful. So I'm so glad that she's with us this evening, and I'd like to welcome Rabbi Spitzer.
Thank you, Shoshana, so much for those kind words. Yes, and Daniel's my buddy, so
No, he said you're the only one I should invite.
Yes. Well, I'm really thrilled to be here. Thanks everyone. Yeah, so let me tell you what I'd like to do tonight. So I have this book that came out in March. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and I think you all bought some, so they'll be available for people who want to purchase one later. I want to sort of talk to you how I got to the book. It was a project of about 10 years. How I got to the book, sort of the premise behind the book. I'll read a little bit, and then we'll open it up for some conversation. So I'm a Reconstructionist rabbi, and as a good Reconstructionist, I was sort of wrestling my whole time in rabbinical school and after with how to really talk about God for people who might, want to be affiliated Jewishly, have a spiritual life, but are uncomfortable with traditional God language. For a while, I was engaged with process theology, which talks about God as in process, God as a process, which was very, fitting with Mordecai Kaplan and Reconstructionist thought. And then I sort of happened upon this book in a bookstore, and the book is called I as an Other, The Secret Life of Metaphor and How It Shapes How We See the World. It's a very long name of a book by James Geary. And the book, which came out in the early 2000s, sort of summarized the work of cognitive linguistics up to that time. And I want to and this book really just transformed my thinking about how we think about everything, but especially how we think about God. So I want to first take a step back, introduce you a little bit to some of the takeaways I have, from cognitive linguistics, and then come back, circle back to God. So I'm just gonna share my screen for a moment. So my book is about metaphor, um, and I begin by the first couple chapters of the book explore why metaphor. Why is metaphor so important? So this is just a paragraph from the introduction from this book I just mentioned. I as an other, the secret life of metaphor and how it shapes the way we see the world. So as I read this paragraph, I'm going to ask you to notice all the metaphors in this paragraph. Metaphorical thinking, our instinct not just for describing, but for comprehending one thing in terms of another, shapes our view of the world and is essential to how we communicate, learn, discover, and invent. Metaphor is a way of thought long before it is a way with words. For centuries, metaphor has been seen as a kind of cognitive frill, a pleasant but essentially useless embellishment to normal thought. Now the frill is gone, ha ha ha. New research in the social and cognitive sciences make it increasingly plain that metaphorical thinking influences our attitudes, beliefs, and actions in surprising, hidden, and often oddball ways. Metaphor is finally left off the page and landed with a mighty splash right in the middle of our stream of consciousness. So one of the claims that Gary makes early in the book is that you can't read a paragraph in the newspaper without stumbling over many, many metaphors, and there's many in here. And again, he's not trying to put them all in there. They're just there. The notion that a type of thinking can shape our view of the world is already a metaphor, that a view is something physical that can be shaped. Metaphor is a way of thought, right? This notion that an idea is like a path. The idea that metaphor is a frill, that there's a stream of consciousness. So there's a metaphor implicit in here. And it's based on the early work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, which began in the 1990s. And they discovered really in our speech that we can't really talk about anything abstract or complex without using metaphor. So I want to show you how metaphor works, and then sort of talk a little bit about why it's important. So this is how conceptual metaphor works. This is how Lakoff and Johnson describe it working. The target domain is the realm of human experience that we need metaphor to access. We actually can't think about or talk about these areas of our experience without metaphors. It's just impossible. That's the way our brains work. The source domain is the part of our embodied experience, our physical experience, that is used to make meaning of the target domain. The target domain is always abstract or complex, and the source domain is very specific. So the metaphors here are anger is a hot liquid in a container, or anger is a horse. Now that sounds ridiculous, but we manifest this in our language all the time. So for example, anger is a hot liquid in a container. They are boiling mad. She blew her top. I need to blow off some steam. Anger is a horse, unbridled anger. He couldn't rein in his temper. Here are some ways you can harness your anger. So we see in our language how metaphor manifests, again, completely in an unthinking way. We're not trying to be poetic. This is just how we think. To talk about ideas, it's impossible to talk about ideas without many different metaphors. Some of the ones that Lakoff and Johnson explore, ideas are people, ideas are food, ideas are plants, ideas are commodities. And again, we see it in our language. Ideas are food. She devoured the book. Let that idea gel. That theory is half-baked. Ideas are people. He's the father of modern biology. Cognitive psychology is in its infancy. Ideas are commodities. It's important how you package your ideas. That's a worthless idea, etc. So cognitive linguistics, again, makes this claim that we really can't access certain parts of our experience without metaphor. The next claim that they make that's important for our purposes is that a new metaphor can actually change our experience of reality. And I think the best example of this is a metaphor that is completely common to all of us, which is time is money, or time is a limited resource. This is a metaphor that entered into the world with the Industrial Revolution and people getting paid according to how much time they worked. And it's manifest in our language in lots of ways. We save time, we budget time, we waste time, we spend time. But what's important is that we don't just say that, like we experience it. Like right when we're sitting in a doctor's office for hours and like we need to be somewhere else, we feel like we're wasting time. It's like we get agitated, like we actually feel like we're wasting time. Even though technically speaking, I don't think one can waste time. Like, like scientifically, I don't think that's possible. But that metaphor shapes our experience. Not every culture has that metaphor. No culture had that metaphor over 200 years ago. But once that metaphor entered our consciousness and our culture, it shaped our experience. Um, so so that's let me just want to check one thing. One other thing. Let's see. Yeah. So I'm reading this book about metaphor that's making all these points that I'm just making to you. And in the book, Geary talks about different kinds of metaphors using the analogy of a volcano. And he says, like, there's active volcanoes. So an active metaphor is a metaphor that we know is a metaphor. In the book, I give the example of Mary Oliver's poem. In a poem, she says, "The dark hug of time." It's very obviously a metaphor, like time can't hug us. And poets use metaphor to like get us thinking in new ways. So that's an active metaphor, a metaphor it's clearly a metaphor, not a fact, not a thing. Then there's what he calls dormant metaphors, like a dormant volcano. So it's a metaphor that it's a metaphor, but you're so used to it that you don't have to really think about it. One example he gives is, "I'm up a creek without a paddle." So that's like a metaphor, and clearly I'm not really in a creek or in a boat, but you know what it means. And then finally, he talks about extinct metaphors, and these are metaphors that Lakoff and Johnson call metaphors we live by. And these are metaphors that we have no idea they're metaphors when we use them. We say them as if they're not as if they're just sort of reality, and they're not. Very common ones. "I see what you mean." "I see what you mean" is a metaphor. Seeing, knowing is seeing, and it's based on infant experience. That if we don't see something, it doesn't exist. But it has nothing to do with seeing, right? "I see what you mean" it means I understand what you're saying. And even people who are blind will use this metaphor because it's such a basic metaphor. Another one is, "She's a very warm person," where, human, like emotional connection is warmth, is physical warmth. And again, this comes from infant experience of being held, close to a body and feeling warmth when we feel safe. So these kind of metaphors, Geary called extinct metaphors, like an extinct volcano. And they shape our experience, they shape our language, they shape our thought, and we're completely unaware of it 99% of the time. And I had this aha moment, and I was like, God is an extinct metaphor. Most people, at least in the West, when we say God, when we think about God, whether we believe in God or don't believe in God, it doesn't matter. There's a metaphor at play, and that metaphor is God as a big person. And it's in our language, it's in our assumptions, and that is what people argue about. When people say, "I believe in God" or "I don't believe in God," that's usually the metaphor they're arguing about. So metaphors aren't bad or good, but you need more than one. And so I felt like that metaphor is limiting. And for any complex experience, like ideas, like love, like time, we need multiple metaphors. Time isn't always experienced as a precious resource or as money. Sometimes time, we experience it as an endless flow in different directions, and it depends on our experience in that moment. So when it comes to God, we need a lot of metaphors. And luckily, when I turned to our tradition, to Jewish tradition, especially to the Hebrew Bible, I realized our ancestors had an incredible palette of metaphors. They had like a whole rainbow of colors. We've got like blue and, one shade of green. Like we barely have any as moderns. And here they had so many. And so the point of the book is to really resurrect some of these metaphors. So before I sort of enter into the metaphors themselves, I just wanted to share one last thing about metaphor that's really important going forward. So these are a few things about metaphor that it's important to understand. First is what I've just been talking about. We need metaphor to grasp, to talk about, to understand complex, abstract human experiences. That is, metaphor is not optional. It's not a literary, addition. It's fundamental to our brains. I'm taking this as a scientific fact. It's really important to understand that a metaphor is not a definition. It's an articulation of experience. Time is not a limited resource. We experience it that way. It's a real experience, but that is not a definition of time. when we come to complex things, not one metaphor will do. As I said earlier, with the new metaphor of time is money, metaphors have the power to shape our reality, which I think is important when we talk about God. The issue is not whether a metaphor is true or false. The question is, how does this metaphor shape our thought and action? It's not true or false that God is a big person, because God is not a big person. The question is, what does that metaphor do for us? What's positive? What's challenging? What are the implications of that metaphor? What happens when we shift metaphor? I'm going to be talking with you about God as water. What happens when God is water and is not a big person? What shifts? What changes? Again, God is neither water nor a big person, but those two metaphors can profoundly affect our experience. And finally, metaphor is always grounded in our embodied experience. So the source for the metaphor is always concrete and tangible, which is important when we're dealing with something as abstract and untangible as the divine. It's important that the metaphors themselves are embodied. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I want to go on and explore a couple metaphors with you. Is that pretty clear? Is there any question just about that little piece that this is like really fast. The first 2 chapters of the book goes into this in much more depth, but did people feel okay if we move on? I just want to read a little bit. I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction of the first chapter of the book, and then I'm going to jump into a metaphor. And this is sort of laying out the challenge of the dominant metaphor we're in, and then I want to introduce some other metaphors. So I've argued that an unspoken, assumed metaphor underlying much of our discussion of God today is the notion that God is a big, powerful person. And while God is never described directly as a big person in the Hebrew Bible, there is definitely a lot of metaphoric imagery that supports that notion. Messengers of God often appear looking like ordinary people, and God is described as having human features like a voice and arms, and doing human things like getting angry, talking, and having regrets. Let me see. The poem in Exodus 15 describing God's triumph over the Egyptian army at the Sea of Reeds speaks of God as a man of war. Elsewhere in Exodus, we read of Moses talking with God face to face, as a person speaks to his friends. In his book, The God of Old, James Kugel notes that in later parts of the Hebrew Bible, God becomes a more distant power, experienced by people in a less immediate and intimate way compared to earlier texts. After the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE, God became increasingly understood as a kind of emperor, distant and very powerful. The Israelite God was now understood to be not just the God of one small nation, but the power that ruled the entire world and used human empires for his own purposes. This imperial God is the basis of the metaphor that most of us assume to be the Jewish, and to a great extent Christian and Muslim God, the distant, all-knowing, all-powerful king. But this metaphor is precisely that, just one particular metaphor. It is decidedly not the same metaphorical understanding that underlies earlier texts in the Hebrew Bible, where God is never portrayed as all-knowing or all-powerful in the sense of controlling everything. Kugel writes that these early texts, quote, seem to be trying to tell us something rather sophisticated about God's very nature. And that something has little to do with the great omniscient and omnipresent deity of later times, end quote. What is also important is that along with all this human imagery, there are other biblical depictions of God that are decidedly non-human. We are first introduced to God in the book of Genesis as a wind that hovers over the waters. In Exodus, we're told that God brings the Israelites out of Egypt on eagle's wings. And Moses first encounters God as, or somehow within, a burning bush in the desert. In the book of Psalms and throughout the prophetic writings, God is described as life-giving water, as devouring and refining fire, as a rock, as light. Our biblical ancestors employed a breathtaking palette of metaphors to describe their experiences of the sacred. As a tribal people deeply connected to the land, it is not surprising that they use metaphors grounded in their experiences of the natural world. So the rest of the book, after the first introductory chapters, in each chapter I explore a different metaphor, and mostly from Hebrew Bible. One is rabbinic, one chapter deals with a couple modern metaphors, and sort of describe how I think the ancients understood this metaphor, how I understand the metaphor, and then I offer some practices to to try to bring the metaphor back to life, because we can't just read about these metaphors. The reality is that the God is a big person metaphor is so deeply ingrained in us that we need to actively sort of foster these other metaphors. So I wanted to dive in, as it were, to the first metaphor I want to explore with you, which is God as water. So I'm going to ask you to do something for 2 minutes. If you have something to write on, that would be great. I'm going to share a picture on screen. So these are some pictures of water. Just going to ask you to write. You can either just think or write for a few moments, just words or phrases like what associations do you have looking at these pictures of water? A drop of water, rain, a stream or river, a pond. You can write to yourself, or if you'd like just to write in the chat, just associations with water that these pictures bring to mind. Let's just take 2 minutes. And again, if you'd like to write to yourself, or if you want to share in the chat, just words, phrases, associations with water. Take 1 more minute. And again, feel free to share in the chat. I'd love to see your associations. All right, let's see what folks wrote. Nourishing, life-giving, calming, peaceful, cooling, cleansing, refreshing, suspended time, lovely, flowing, cycles, power, nourishment. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. All right, so keep those images in mind. I'm going to share a little bit from the chapter on water. If you have the book, I'm beginning the chapter Drinking from God, which is page 39. The year he turned 40, my father suffered a massive heart attack. I remember coming home from school that afternoon and being told by my mother what had happened. It was a total shock. My father was young, strong, seemingly healthy. Heart attacks were things that happened on TV or in the movies, not to me or the people I loved. Thankfully, my father survived. He spent over a month in the hospital and came home a different person than the man who went in. After decades of smoking 1 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day, he became a virulent non-smoker. After years of working long hours and subsisting largely on coffee and cigarettes, he pulled way back on the work hours and watched his diet carefully. Beginning a few months after he got home from the hospital, my father would drive out to the Calvert Cliffs in Maryland, almost an hour from our house, to walk along the beach and collect shark's teeth and other fossils. He would spend hours there, methodically searching the sand at the base of the cliffs. Wading through the water by the shore, he developed an incredible patience, able to see shark's teeth lying in the sand that to me were invisible. At around the same time, my father took up kayaking. This was the late 1970s and early 80s, before paddling became a popular leisure time activity. To learn how to navigate in whitewater, my dad took a week-long course in North Carolina. He would practice rolling his kayak at the local pool. But even though he ended up joining a boat club where Olympic kayakers trained, he wasn't trying to become competitive. He simply loved being out on the Potomac River, whether paddling through flat water or floating down the rapids. I do not think it was entirely coincidental that water-related activities became my father's de facto spiritual practice after his near-death experience. Water is a powerful force of nature, and many people are drawn to spend time by the ocean or by lakes and streams. We owe our very lives to the availability of water. Indeed, the majority of ourselves are largely made up of water. In many cultures, water is a symbol of life and power. It is therefore not so surprising that water is one of the most prevalent metaphors for God in the Hebrew Bible. And this was, I was sort of amazed by when I started looking in Tanakh, in Hebrew Bible, how many metaphors for the divine there were. So I just want to read a little more about water. I grew up in Maryland, where access to water was never an issue. There was plenty of rain year-round, and so much humidity in the summer you could practically drink the air. Then, at the age of 18, I went to spend a year in Israel, living on a kibbutz in the Negev desert. Suddenly, water was a precious resource. Rain only fell in the winter months, and in the orchards where I worked, the trees were sustained by miles of drip irrigation tubes. It was hot but dry in the summer, and we Americans had to be constantly reminded to drink. I remember our first hike in the desert, stopping to take a drink from my canteen. I didn't even realize, until the water hit my mouth, how incredibly thirsty I was. It is hard to express how deeply satisfying that canteen of lukewarm water was in that moment. That experience comes to mind as I read biblical passages where the author speaks of thirsting for God and drinking from a godly well or stream. And these are some verses from Psalms. How precious is your love, O God! Humanity is nourished from the riches of your house. You give them drink from the stream of your delight. Elohim, you are my God. I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. As the deer longs for water streams, so does my soul long for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When I think of my father walking along the water's edge by the Calvert Cliffs, or paddling on the Potomac, I wonder if his soul was drinking in some kind of spiritual sustenance, even as his physical self was enjoying the literal waters. I know that this metaphor of a thirsty soul resonates with me. It is an accurate description of those times when I feel spiritually dry, as if some essential source of nourishment has been cut off. In those moments, I am like that deer in the Judean desert, searching for an afik, a channel in the earth that fills when it rains. At these times, God is the source from which my thirsty soul can be quenched, if only I am willing to drink. In the words of the prophet Isaiah, I can be like that orchard in the Negev, nourished by godly waters. And this is from Isaiah. Adonai shall guide you always and satisfy your soul in drought, and you shall be like a watered garden. So I found these very evocative. I want to just share some of those verses with you that I mentioned in the book. That really, and that sort of proved to me that I think this water metaphor was quite powerful for our ancestors. So these are from a couple, there's many, these are just a couple from Psalms. And we see some phrases reoccurring. I call them water names for the divine. I think these might have been ways that our ancestors actually, referred to God, perhaps prayed to God. This is from Psalm 36. It's actually part of the liturgy when we put on the talit. How precious is your love, O God! Humanity is nourished from the riches of your house. You give them drink from your Edenic stream. It was hard to translate this. Yirvayun mideshen beitecha v'nachal adanecha tashkem. Nachal adanecha, which is like your stream of delight, Edenic stream, waters of Eden. It's a very beautiful image. For with you is the fountain of life. Ki imcha makor chayim. With you is the fountain of life. And then in another Psalm 65, you care for, again, the psalmist is speaking to God, you care for the earth and water it. You greatly enrich it with the river of God, which is full of water. Peleg Elohim Malay Mayim. I love that image. So again, Peleg Elohim, maybe that was a water name of the divine. We also find the prophets, especially Isaiah and Jeremiah, and also Hosea, use water metaphors for the divine all the time. Here, Jeremiah is excoriating the people and says, my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. Makor Mayim Chaim. This is clearly a name of God because it's saying it's me. So they have forsaken me. Makor Mayim Chaim. This was a name of the divine, the fountain, the fount or the fountain of living waters, and dug cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns which can hold no water. So that which is not God is a broken cistern which cannot hold water, and God's self is water. And then from Isaiah, this beautiful image that comes from this is part of the Yom Kippur Haftarah, that if we follow in God's ways, if we do what we're supposed to do, Adonai shall guide you always and satisfy your soul in drought. And you shall be, here the you is us, you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters fail not. So Adonai is that which waters us, which nourishes us. So I think I want to share another metaphor with you all, but let's pause here actually, and before I go on to the next metaphor, I'm just curious if you can put in the chat, or if you want to unmute, just if this sort of metaphor of the divine as water evokes anything for you. What comes up for you as you sort of hear these texts or think about this? Anybody want to either put something in the chat or unmute or raise your Zoom hand, and we can call on you. I'm curious how this particular metaphor strikes you.
Rabbi, it looks like we're all just taking it in right now.
Okay.
Shoshana offered something in the chat.
Yeah, soothing. Very nice. Very nice. The other thing that happens, I'm going to read one more piece from the water chapter for you, and then go on to a different, share two other metaphors. What also I discovered when I shifted the metaphor to water, yes, thank you. We're trading God's image, and we are in large part water. Yes, I talk about that in the book. We're 70% water, and all of a sudden the notion of being B'Tselem Elohim really changes, right? Instead of thinking of God as a person, all of a sudden we realize, well, what does it mean to be made of godly stuff, right? We're divine. We have this divinity running through us. Yes, that's beautiful. For you, it doesn't hold water, Arnie. Okay, keep your mind open. We'll keep going. When we shift the metaphor to water from God as big person, it really changes a number of things. And one thing it changes is how we think about power. That sort of metaphor of God as a ruler or a distant emperor, a king or an emperor exerts power in a very particular kind of way. Water is also very powerful. I think someone put power earlier when I asked for your associations, but it's a very different kind of power. It wears down. There's a flow. Justice is described in terms of water throughout the Hebrew Bible, especially in the prophets. So it really shifts how we think about power. But for me, it was also this metaphor became really important in a really difficult time in my life, in thinking about how do we confront difficulty and pain in our own lives. So I want to share one more thing from the water chapter, and then I'm going to share a little bit from a couple other metaphors. Again, if you have the book, this is page 49, Troubled Waters. I found the metaphor of God as water to be enormously helpful during some of the most challenging months of my life. In the spring of 2014, my spouse, Gina, was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. After a year of experimental treatments in which she was relatively symptom-free, in the fall of 2015, things took a turn for the worse, and she died the following March. Those months leading up to her death, during which she endured a nasty course of chemotherapy, were profoundly difficult. I needed every ounce of strength and compassion I could find to be a support to Gina and to keep from being overwhelmed by sadness and despair. During this journey, I found myself drawn to a chant composed by my colleague and teacher, Rabbi Shefa Gold, a setting of a verse from the book of Isaiah. And this is the verse. When you pass through the waters, I am with you. I won't let the rivers overwhelm you. Ki ta'avor b'mayim idcha ani, u'v'neharot lo yishtafucha. Again, when you pass through the waters, I am with you. I won't let the rivers overwhelm you. Chanting these words, I realized the profound insight of this verse. As I struggled to understand where God was and the terrible reality I was facing, I realized that water is essential to life. Indeed, water is life. And yet sometimes it is also that which threatens me, overwhelms me, drowns me. God was at one and the same time the waters through which I was passing, and that which supported me as I made my way through an unbearable reality. Facing the prospect of the death of my beloved, I didn't rail against the unfairness of an inscrutable God who had brought suffering into my life. Instead, I did my best to sit with the reality that ultimately faces each and every one of us. I remembered my father's instruction to lean into, not away from, the turbulence when navigating a kayak through the rapids. I understood that the waves can be overwhelming and terrifying, and yet within them is the godly presence that sustains and supports me, even in the most difficult moments. I gave myself over to overwhelming waters, allowing myself to feel the profound sorrow within them, even as I sought the reassurance of God's presence accompanying me as I made my way down the river. So that time was really interesting to me as I thought about sort of God, or reality, capital R, as water, and the divine as both that reality and also that which sort of buoyed me up. And the question became not like, why is this happening to me, but how do I navigate this? And that was a very helpful question. It was a terrible reality, but it was a great question. How do I navigate this? So with your permission, I'm going to just read a little bit more. I want to read from 2 other chapters just so you get a little flavor of the other metaphors, and then I want to open it up. So a very different metaphor is, but another very common one. So if God as water is very common in Tanakh, God as rock, Sor, is common both in the Hebrew Bible and in our liturgy. And like with water, I wanted to see, like, well, what would it be like to take this metaphor seriously and really think about it as a way to experience, think about the divine. So this is from the chapter on rock, rock of my heart. In the winter of 2017, I began visiting people being detained in a local prison for various immigration violations, and sometimes for no violation at all. I met a Guatemalan father of 4 who had been living and working in the US for decades without any trouble, an elderly Iraqi man with serious health problems, lesbians from Uganda seeking asylum from the horrifying abuse they had experienced at home. None had done anything particularly wrong, yet they were stuck in this prison for months, often separated from their spouses and children, the threat of deportation hanging over them. Each person, each story was different. But what struck me about so many of these people was their incredible faith in God. Separated from their families and community, having no idea how long they would be in this situation, they somehow held on. They had a palpable sense of God's presence with them, even or especially in their darkest moments. While I was ostensibly the religious figure in the visiting room, on more than one occasion I felt that the faith of the person sitting across from me far exceeded my own. The image that came to me in those moments was of God as these people's rock, their refuge and strength. There are numerous biblical verses in which God is called rock, and many seem as if they were written by people in circumstances similar to those I met in prison. And these are some of the verses. To you, Adonai, I cry, my rock, do not be silent to me. For if you are silent to me, I will be like those who go down into the pit. Save me quickly, be for me a rock of refuge. For you are my rock and my fortress. Be for me a sheltering rock that I can always come to. For the detainees I visited, God as sheltering rock was a source of strength and resilience, a fortress protecting them from despair, a rock of refuge during lonely and confusing times. The biblical metaphor of God as rock is associated with a time of fear and struggle in the early life of King David. Before he became king, the young David was forced to flee into the wilderness, pursued by a jealous and increasingly paranoid King Saul. He hid in caves and rocky places in the Judean desert for many months before finally emerging victorious. The book of Samuel, which recounts David's long and complex life, includes a poem prayer in David's voice on the day that Adonai delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. In this poem, David says, quote, Yud-He Vav-He is my rock and my fortified place, a rescuer for me. My God is my rock, I take refuge in it. My shield and the strength that saves me, my fortress and refuge, my Savior, you save me from violence. This poem also appears in the book of Psalms, and indeed many of the Psalms that call on God as rock are attributed to David. Perhaps there was a tradition associating David's experience of seeking shelter in the craggy cliffs of the Judean desert with an image of God as rock. A personal experience of finding refuge, gave shape to an enduring metaphor for divine shelter and protection. In turn, this metaphor has spoken to many others seeking safety from harm. The refrain of a powerful African American spiritual, rooted in the experience of slavery, draws directly on the biblical tradition of God as rock. And this is a quote from the song. My God is a rock in the weary land, the weary land. My God is a rock in the weary land, shelter in the time of storm. I first heard this song sung by Bessie Jones of the Georgia Sea Island Singers, recorded in 1961. Jones, born in 1902, most likely learned this song from her grandfather, Jet Sampson, who as a child was kidnapped in Africa and brought to America as a slave. Sampson passed on to his granddaughters songs and other cultural traditions from his time on plantations. I wonder what it must have been like for Bessie Jones to hear these words sung by a man who had survived slavery, who had experienced emancipation and the promise of Reconstruction, and then the violence and despair of Jim Crow. What must that image of God as sheltering rock have meant to Mr. Sampson as he endured the oppression of slavery and its aftermath? What inspiration and hope did it give Ms. Jones and her contemporaries as they added their voices to the struggle for African American civil rights in the 1950s and 60s? The legacy of God as rock is a powerful one. Whatever our own experiences of suffering, the metaphor of rock offers the possibility of finding protection and shelter when we feel besieged and weak, a place of rest in the weary land of our lives. It attests to a power that literally grounds us in the solidity of the earth. The sheltering rock that I can always come to promises that in the turmoil and pain of this world, healing can be found. So rock goes on. Rock is a very beautiful metaphor. I want to close my reading and then we'll open it up from the last chapter, where I wanted to include some more modern metaphors for the divine. So I chose two for the final chapter. One is GPS. I call it Godly Positioning System, and the other is electricity. So I just want to read you from the part about electricity, and then we'll open it up. So this is page 247. A few years into my rabbinate, I was on a retreat with about 30 other rabbis from across the Jewish denominations. On the opening night, we did a get-to-know-you exercise in which we had a series of 3-minute conversations with one another, each with a different prompt. As I moved around the circle of colleagues, I prepared to answer the question, if you hadn't become a rabbi, and money or ability or prerequisite knowledge were not an issue, what would you have been? I was pretty sure I was going to say I'd have become a community organizer. I had worked in a variety of progressive organizations before going to rabbinical school, and I identified as a social justice activist. So imagine my surprise when it was my turn to answer the question, and what came out of my mouth was, I would have been a physicist. The reason I found this completely surprising is that I am terrible at math and never got anywhere near a physics class in my high school or college years. There is no one less likely to have become a physicist than I. But after I gave my answer, I realized that I do share something with those who are blessed to do physics, a sense of wonder at the universe, and a deep desire to understand how things work. As a rabbi, I get to engage in big questions, and I seek to discern what kind of meaningful order in what often, some kind of meaningful order in what often feels like a disordered, chaotic world. I want to know what makes us tick, and what the larger context is for human existence. And while I can't really fathom what physicists do, I wonder if some of the same desires and curiosities are at play. When I read the Hebrew Bible, I imagine that its authors were sort of like me, and sort of like modern physicists, seeking answers to how the cosmos works and what our place in it is. Their experience of the divine was part of that exploration, was in fact inseparable from it. Science offers metaphors that help me understand some of the more challenging aspects of the biblical portrayal of God. Among the most difficult stories in the Bible are those in which seemingly unsuspecting characters get zapped by God. A good example is the story of Nadav and Avihu. Aaron's oldest sons make an unauthorized offering at the altar and are immediately consumed by the divine fire. Something similar happens in the book of Samuel, when King David attempts to bring the Ark of the Covenant, a gold box holding the stone tablets that Moses received at Mount Sinai to his capital city of Jerusalem. The ark is being transported on an ox cart, and when the oxen stumble, one of the men guiding the cart, a guy named Uzzah, reaches out to steady the ark. When he touches it, God is incensed and strikes him down, and Uzzah dies. This story seems even worse than the episode with Nadav and Avihu. They at least could be accused of making a dubious offering in an irresponsible way. All that poor Uzzah did was try to keep the holy ark from falling out of a cart. Why in the world would God strike him down? Earlier in the Bible, the Israelites are warned that only the tribe of the Levites are authorized to transport the various items of the Mishkan, the Holy Tabernacle. And the men responsible for transporting the ark via a set of poles fastened to rings on its sides have to be extremely careful not to actually touch it, or they will die. When God strikes Uzzah in the story of the ox cart, it seems to be the unavoidable consequence of someone touching a holy object that is profoundly dangerous to humans. The best that I can understand how the ancient Israelites understood this holy danger is through the metaphor of electricity. The Holy of Holies at the center of the Mishkan housed the ark, which functions something like the core of a nuclear reactor, supplying the sacred energy that was then channeled by the priests through their rituals. Just as enormous precautions have to be taken to safely make use of nuclear energy, so too did those who interacted with the Mishkan and the ark at its center have to take extreme care not to get zapped. When the book of Samuel describes God being incensed when Uzzah touches the ark, we can understand it less as the emotion of anger and more like a natural physical reaction. It's akin to me being able to safely use the electric power that is supplied to my home as long as it is wired and grounded properly. I need to avoid sticking my finger in a socket. Hapless Uzzah had the best of intentions, but by touching the ark, he did the biblical equivalent of holding up a metal rod in a lightning storm and got a shock that took his life. The question remains, why did the authors of the Bible perceive godly power as so inherently dangerous? What truth were they trying to convey in these metaphors of fire and electricity and the stories of zapping that happens to people both innocent and guilty? My answer is that the biblical authors were acknowledging a simple reality. To be alive is pretty damn scary. We exist in a universe that is largely, even today, beyond our understanding. We are often at the mercy of forces beyond our control. The ancients were very honest about God, and the Bible is not a Hallmark greeting card. It is a wholly, sometimes contradictory muddle of beauty and horror, love and pain, hope and hopelessness, a lot like life. And somewhere within and behind all of this complexity is Yud He Vav He, the source of life itself. As the prophet Isaiah audaciously declared, forming light and creating darkness, making peace and creating destruction, I, Adonai, do all these things. There is only one power source of the universe, the prophet teaches. It manifests in that which we find pleasant and in that which scares us. It both sustains us and makes us mortal. And just as with electrical current, if we don't properly channel that divine power, we can generate some extreme shocks. As the world witnessed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, when human beings start playing with the primal energies of the universe, we take on godlike powers of both creation and destruction. Perhaps the Bible was right in warning us that there are some things that we humans should just not touch. I think I will pause there. I'd love to open it up. Or Shoshana, let me know if there's some questions that have come in.
So I'm going to start, and I'm hope that you will, you out there in Zoom land, will put some questions in the chat for me. And so I'll just begin, but thank you, Toba. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I found what you said to be so very natural. For me, it just all kind of hangs together. But interestingly enough, it took me back a long time ago. I remember when Mordecai Kaplan came to give a talk at my religion class, and I found him shockingly wonderful. However, what I remember is the question someone else asked, and that it was what they asked that day over 60 years ago. And the question was, how do I pray to the power that makes for salvation? And I think since then, I've always heard the question asked, and tonight I could imagine that some people thinking right now, even though we're not defining a metaphor is definitely not a definition, but I can imagine people thinking, how do I pray to a metaphor? And so I wondered if you can help us with that.
Yeah,
'Cause
that's a
that's a
great question.
question I literally have heard for
Yeah.
6 years.
We don't pray to a metaphor. God is not a metaphor. We access God through metaphors. And so, I think the question is not, we're not praying to a metaphor. We're praying to we're doing whatever we do when we pray, and there are different kinds of prayers. To me, the question is more, what metaphors give us access to that experience? So if the name Adonai does it for you, use Adonai. If Makor Mayim Chaim, the fount of godly waters, like opens up something for you, like use that. I think because so many people have such a problem with God as a big person, they just don't pray at all. I mean, maybe they say the words in the prayer book, but they're not actually praying. So, my hope in sort of this, in offering this menu, and Arnie, I saw your comment. You're right. We don't, at different times, different metaphors speak to us in different ways, and it depends where we are in our life and what's going on. And it's in our liturgy. I mean, our liturgy says Sur Yisrael, Sur Yishenu, like the liturgy itself has these different metaphors in it. Kaplan tended towards the abstract. I'm trying to go the other direction than Kaplan. I mean, my work I feel is based on his very much, but he, I think, shared this sort of progressivist notion that as humans get more civilized or something, we get more sophisticated. We're closer to the idea, and his ideas of God were like getting more and more abstract. I've sort of gone the other way and said, actually, we need to reconnect to things that are more fundamental. But let me give you a concrete example, Shoshana, of something that happened when I started teaching this that really showed me that this metaphor stuff works, because I didn't know. Like, I started teaching this, I was like, I don't know, is this going to work or not? So there's a woman that came to the class my first time I taught this, and we were exploring the metaphor of makom, of God as place. That's it's a rabbinic metaphor. It's one of the chapters. And we use this name we use it all the time, hamakom yenechem etchem, may hamakom comfort you. But I really wanted to take seriously the notion of thinking of the divine as place. So we had explored some texts around God as place. I had sent people off for a week to like think about place, and and I asked people to think about places that are important to them and what those places conjure up for them. The next week, this woman who I didn't know, actually, she wasn't a member of my congregation, but she had come to the class. She came in, she had been to services somewhere else the Shabbat before. And she told this story. She said, I always have a problem when I get to the Shema. Like, I can't say the Shema, she said, because I don't really believe in God. And so I can't say Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad because I don't believe in it. She said, but I resonate really strongly with place. She said, so this past Shabbat, she said, when I was in services, during the service, I just called to mind all these places that are really important to me and really sacred to me and just powerful for me. And she said, so I was just sitting there thinking about all these places. She said, and then when I got to the Shema, I brought all those places together into one. And she said, I had an experience like I've never had before. And I feel like I experienced God. And I was like, whoa, like, so she took the metaphor and, did her own thing with it, so she wasn't praying to a metaphor, but she was using the metaphor to access an experience that the other metaphor of God, whatever one that was an obstacle to her, wasn't allowing her to have. So there's a lot of practices in the book. Each chapter has practices to really let people experience what, where might this metaphor take me? If I'm in a hard place, if I'm in a hard place and I need a sense of shelter, what might it be like to like carry a rock around and or keep them on my desk and then use those names, the rock names. There's a whole bunch of rock names in the book. There's water names. That's, I think, I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but that's how I think about it. Like, it's using the metaphors to access something. It's not praying to them, but it's using the metaphors to get to that sense of connection or sense of sustenance or sense of nourishment or whatever it is we're seeking. I mean, we're seeking different things at different times.
Well, here's Arnie.
Yeah.
I think the water metaphor relates better to Torah. We can rely on Torah for daily nourishment, but God we call on mostly when we need God. Rock works better as a metaphor for God, but I won't lose away any of the metaphors for God. I need them all, depending on the situation at hand. In parentheses, not literally at hand,
Right, of
though.
course. Yeah. So again, Arnie, I think, water is a metaphor for Torah. Like, there's as many metaphors for Torah as there are for God. Torah is also called fire. Torah is light. There's many metaphors. But I think for some people, in the one of the names for God, Ma'aneh HaYeshua, the wells of liberation or wells of salvation. That's a
Mhm.
that's a metaphor for the divine that we have in Psalms, and I think that's a beautiful metaphor, like that internal. Maybe there's an internal well that we go to for nourishment. So Torah can be nourishment, but other practices can be nourishment. Rock is powerful. The other metaphors I explore in the book are voice, sound, cloud, fire, and again they speak to all different aspects of our experience. So yeah, and I really encourage people to try them out. And some people resonate more easily to certain ones than other ones. I wouldn't reject the ones you don't resonate with, but they might be waiting for you for another time, or you might want to try them out because they don't resonate and see what they're like. Um,
I think
and
that's what really Arnie was trying to say.
Yeah, exactly. That really depends. And then Michael wrote, if we
Oh,
talk
yeah.
about God in metaphors, do you think God answers us in metaphors? Oh man, how do we experience the answer? That's a great question. I think, yeah, I mean, we get the answers however we're open to receiving them.
Well, we use the metaphor of the like children of Israel.
Oh, everything's yeah, and yes, how we think about ourselves as Jews are also metaphors. Debbie wrote, how do you discuss God with children? If we're not careful, the youngest children get the idea of the old man in the sky. Then grade school kids struggle with the invisible everywhere God and struggle with how to replace the childish image they heard first. Debbie, I completely agree. And I've taught this to kids. I mean, I'm still figuring out how to do that, but kids get it. And hopefully my next iteration of the book is a young person's version with lots of pictures. That's what I'd like to do. And I sort of see it as planting seeds. I don't talk to the kids about metaphor per se, but we look at pictures of water and then our associations and then how that might be like God. Um, I've had done rock stuff with, I've had kids collect rocks, and then we talk about that. They can do it. They can totally do it. But you're right. Pretty relatively early on, some of these other metaphors come in and shut down their thinking, which is a shame. And by studying this with them, I try to keep their mind open. But it's definitely, it's definitely a struggle. It's not an easy thing. Yeah.
Well, it turns out I will at some point have something to show you, because a while back I did research on 1,000 Jewish kids and how they conceptualize God. And kind of at the last minute in this research, I asked the children to draw a picture that tells about God.
Hmm.
And I'm trying to think back now, but basically the pictures could be divided into 3 categories. About a third were about God as a creator or somehow like a force. And,
Mm-hmm.
and another one was sort of in our relationship to God, and that included a lot of mitzvahs like be good, do this, do that. But the third one was very interesting because children perceive God as an enabler for them. And that was very shocking to me and very beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So I think kids can actually almost naturally go to more metaphors than we think they're capable of understanding.
I agree. I actually want to share something with you. This is a sheet that I've shared with kids and asked them to choose their favorite name. Um, so I call this the many names of Adonai, and I give them this sheet, and I say these are all names that God is called in our tradition: um, voice, breath, compassionate one, place, spirit, becoming, rock, father, mother, rock, fountain of life, river of delight, source of living waters, song, the force I throw in there from Star Wars, life of the cosmos, the way, infinity. Um, and kids can totally get this. Like that, these are all like we have all these names, you know. So this is one way I do it. Just look at all these names that we have in our tradition. Which ones, which ones do you respond to? So yeah, so I think there's lots of ways to teach this to kids, for sure. Other questions, thoughts, or reactions? I'd love to hear.
Toba, could you speak a little bit more about, not, shouldn't say more, but just say a word about when you talk about God as voice, because I found that very interesting in your book.
Yeah, so one of the metaphors is kol, this Hebrew word kol, kufav lamed, which is sometimes voice, sometimes sound, and it's sort of the way in the Torah how the Israelites experience the divine, um, and it's sort of the divine as communication. It's not exactly a person's voice. Let me see if there's, and I think it sort of relates to our central practice of saying the Shema, that like we're supposed to be listening. Like so, listening is a basic practice in Judaism. Then then sound becomes really important. So yeah, so I sort of explored different places in the Torah that sound is a big part of how the Israelites experience the divine. Certainly at Mount Sinai, but also in the Garden of Eden, and some other places. And this notion then in the biblical tradition that the voice at Sinai reached each person the way that they could understand it. So that voice becomes a metaphor for sort of understanding and accessing tradition in a certain way. I'll just read one little piece from the voice chapter. In his book, How to Be Heard, Secrets for Powerful Listening and Speaking, sound expert Julian Treasure notes that, quote, the human body is 70% water, which makes us rather good conductors of sound. It's not surprising then that sound can powerfully affect us physiologically, changing our heart rate, breathing, hormone secretions, and even our brain waves. All our bodily rhythms can be affected by sounds. Perhaps the divine kol, the divine voice of the early chapters of Genesis, reflects this foundational effect of sound waves upon us. We humans are conductors of the godly voice. Sound is foundational to human experience, whether or not we have the physical ability to hear. In the words of Evelyn Glennie, a virtuoso percussionist who is also profoundly deaf, quote, hearing is basically a specialized form of touch. Sound is simply vibrating air which the ear picks up and converts to electrical signals, which are then interpreted by the brain. The sense of hearing is not the only sense that can do this. Touch can do this too. For some reason, we tend to make a distinction between hearing a sound and feeling a vibration. In reality, they are the same thing, end quote. My colleague, Rabbi Darby Lee, who is also profoundly deaf, connects this insight to the verse in the book of Exodus immediately following God's instructions to the Israelites. All the people saw the voices, the kolot, and the lightning and the sound, the kol of the ram's horn, and the mountains smoking. What does it mean to say that the people saw the voices? The Torah seems to be conveying an experience of sound that goes beyond our usual sense of hearing. In our conversation about this text, Darby told me that as a deaf person, he can see himself present at Sinai because everyone saw the voices. Given his experience of needing to see a person when they speak, whether he is reading their lips or watching them as they sign, seeing and listening are intimately connected. Darby says that he would translate kol as vibration. In our conversation, we connected this translation to contemporary physics and string theory, the idea that everything in the universe is vibrating. Darby told me, quote, we are saturated by these vibrational waves. God is the vibration that saturates the universe. When we understand God through the metaphor of voice, we are giving expression to a foundational experience of something moving through us, something that both shapes who we are and allows us to express ourselves. Voice is about communication and connection, what we put out into the universe and what we take in. And there's a lot of, spiritual practices connected to voice, both silence and speaking, song. So I think sound and vibration is a very, sort of fundamental aspect of spiritual practice. Yes, and yes. So a lot of these metaphors interact with each other. Water, electricity, electricity and fire, sound, water, they're all related. They're all related.
Sometimes I think when we use this language, people think of it as very modern. I mean, this is sort of a new way, but I think what you've shown us also is that it's really a very old, very traditional way. And I was thinking about maybe because Hanukkah's coming, I remember that I once read a piece written by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who suggested that after the Hanukkah candles were lit, you should sit quietly and just stare at the fire. And so I think this is really for all Jews. It's not really just for a movement. It's really old and refreshed. And it's in some ways what you've taught us. It's really for everyone.
For sure, and it's not just for Jews. I mean, I've gotten comments from Christians, Muslims. I think these are very foundational metaphors. Water, fire, rock. These are universal things, and our tradition has its approach to it, but they're certainly not limited to Jewish people by any means. And so, yeah, I think these are very, very universal in a lot of ways metaphors. Again, the specific texts, the specific practices come from our tradition, but I think they're very accessible, which is great. I mean, I'm finding lots of different folks finding the book quite useful. Because I think I wrote the book because I think I found a lot of people who are spiritual. We all have spirits, whether you consider yourself spiritual or not. Like, we all have spirits. We need to nourish our spirit. And so much of the God language in the liturgy is just not accessible to people, or is difficult. And more people, especially younger folks, who say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And it was sort of the baby was getting thrown out with the bathwater. And I felt like like, as you said, just excavating these metaphors that I did not make up, that are, are not modern, they're ancient. And I think the ancients had a connection to the divine that we can't get anywhere near. I really think they were much more close to that realm than we are. I'm sort of curious, how did they do this? How did they connect? How did they find these connections? And the metaphor, they're right there. I mean, they're right in our text. It's just a matter of bringing them back to life. And that's really what the book is attempting to do.
Well, you certainly brought them to light for us. So before we close, I just want to make sure if anyone has a question, you don't have to put it in the chat, but if you'd like to just raise your hand, I'd be happy to call on you before we close. Just want to make sure that everyone's had an opportunity.
Michelle, I see your hand.
Yeah. So
Good.
I don't really have a question, but I was thinking when I heard your name that you had a connection to Farbrengen. So I looked it up, and it said you were the first Farbrengen bat mitzvah.
I was 1975 or 76. Yep, I was the first Rabbi.
Yeah, I was a coordinator for Farbrengen many years ago.
Oh my God, that's awesome. That's great. That's awesome.
Anybody else?
Well, I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this in Bible Baboker and the Library Minyan and the main shul. I think that it's amazingly traditional, but I feel like it's just been refreshed, and I think put in a context that can really speak to us. So I really want to thank you for this incredible, enlightening presentation. And of course, I want to also thank Suzanne. Many, many thanks for being our Zoom master this evening. And I hope that we'll continue this conversation. It's just been a wonderful experience hearing you speak about these new ideas.
Thank you, Shoshana. Thank you so much for the invitation. Really nice to meet everybody. And yeah, hope you enjoyed the book. Spread the word, tell your friends.
You registered and you came, you should check in tomorrow because your copy will be available. So please take advantage of this wonderful idea that Toba had, that she would make these books available for us. And for that, we're very grateful. So good evening, and thank you everyone for coming and for participating. And Toba, it was so nice to have you here.
Really my pleasure. Thanks everyone. Happy Hanukkah. Enjoy.
Thank you. Happy Hanukkah. Thank you so much. And I will be ending the Zoom presently.